Maybe we should get
So,
going.
yeah, let's get going. So, first of all, let Harry and I welcome you to this webinar on the evolution of leadership development in the digital world. And over the next 45 minutes, we hope to share some ideas with you about this topic and also get your insights and questions as well. So as we go through uh, the webinar, let's just start by giving a little introduction to who we are in case you're not familiar with Holt Ashridge. And EF. So as Holt Ashridge and EF, we are part of the world's largest education company. And what that means is we're able to service a whole range of different needs, from language training, cultural exchange programs, and educational travel, right through to executive leadership development programs and digital learning for global leaders, which is where Harry and I work. Holt Ashridge itself, as a business school, is triple accredited, and it's an international business school. So we're used to working with leaders from around the world, and we've got over 60 years experience of delivering executive education to global business leaders. For our customers, that combination of language training and leadership offers access to an even broader learning experience, as well as even greater investment from us in product development and academic innovation. So let's turn to a little bit more about what we're going to be doing today.
Yeah. So we've split this webinar into three sections here. So firstly, what we're going to talk through is the challenges organizations have been facing, accelerated by this COVID-19 crisis. We'll explore those challenges and the ways to think about them. And we'll also talk through some of our research that we conducted in the middle of this summer to understand better the position that leaders such as yourselves are in right now. It's clear that we're experiencing a series of what we might call new normals over the coming year, bringing with us great opportunities for those to embrace the digital opportunities available to them. And for those organizations, this will be an ideal moment to develop their workforce in an agile and responsive way to deal with the unknowns and the complexities that exist there. So in the second and the third part of this webinar, we'll explore both the skills, the competencies, and the strategies needed to thrive in the future, and how your organization can embrace the new normal through leadership development there. So a quick introduction into my background here. So I started off my career in investment banking and then moved into academia. So I'm a professor of strategy and innovation at Holt Ashridge Executive Education, and I'm at Holt Ashridge. I'm the program director for our programs around implementing strategic decisions and also agile innovation for business growth. I work with a wide range of clients, helping them to understand those challenges of building leaders for a new tomorrow. And it's across a variety of industries. I'm sure we're joined by a whole variety today. So I work from a variety of sectors from automotive to healthcare. So over to you, Paul, for an introduction.
Thanks, Harry. So been working at Ashridge Executive Education for the last 12 years, and I work in the areas of strategy, innovation, and customer centricity with like Harry, with clients from all over the world in all different types of sectors. Before that, I spent my time working in industry in a range of different roles in the commercial area of businesses. So working in the oil and gas industry and then telecommunications. And then also finally working in a leadership role running commercial operations for a satellite organization. So literally, I used to be watching this space, and that's what we'll be going to be doing, watching the space of digital as we go through this webinar. So first of all, before we get into saying a little bit more about this, we'd like to understand a little bit about your perspective and get a view of how you describe 2020 so far in one word. And to do this, we're going to use a tool called Mentimeter. So what we'd like you to do is open a browser and go to www.menti.com, as you can see on the screen. And you'll see there's a code there. It'll ask you for a code. And if you enter the code, you'll be able to access the Menti page. And we'd like you to think about one word, just the one word that you'd use to describe 2020 so far. And we're going to create a picture of that using the Mentimeter tool. So if you'd like to go to www.menti.com and then enter the code shown on the slide, and we're going to get a sense from you of the word you'd use to describe 2020 so far. And here we can see the word cloud appearing.
And just as this appears, so the larger words means that more people are putting them in there. So we see right at the heart of this word cloud, the challenging there, uncertainty, and the unpredictability at of where we are. Some describing it there as perhaps a tornado. But we're also seeing this, which is great, this transition between both positives and negatives as we've seen this. And that's what we're going to be talking about more today, about how we think about the current 2020 situation as an opportunity for development there. But of course, as I see here, some ones there, I think I can say bonkers is one of the words to describe it. There is that challenge of just how we're all currently feeling about the constant change which is going on here. So I think we can now switch back then, Paul, to the slides there, as we've kind of grabbed a straw poll of everyone's thoughts there, and you can see this just emerging and changing. We'll be using Mentimeter a little bit later on as well. So thank you for that. So let's just talk through. So in 2020, the world looked so different for most of us. It was a business as normal start to the year. We were working through our strategic plans, our digital ambitions, if we remember back back in January there, thinking about our strategy. And some of us were even talking about working from home policies and how that might all work in the future. We had hopes, dreams, and more importantly, we had some form of stability of where we could pin things around from. And then things fundamentally changed here. The impact of COVID-19 shifted and changed the focus of those plans. And as you'll see here on the next slide, as we go across, here's that time here in the UK, this iconic moment of when we officially had begun our start in the COVID crisis here. And the impact of COVID shifted and changed the focus of those plans I just talked about. It brought about unprecedented levels of uncertainty. We've lived in a VUCA world for quite some time, but we can see this as VUCA times 10, or even for some of those, as we saw in that word cloud there, VUCA times 100. And it accelerated trends around the future of work at levels that we couldn't really have imagined. For many organizations, the rapid shift to remote working and the closure of traditional routes to market forced innovation in their digital strategies out of necessity and survival. And we've seen this acceleration of projects that were planned in years to take place that had to take place in months going forward. So at Ashridge, we've tried to look at how we can think about this, and to help us better understand how we can help and respond to these challenges over the summer, we've been developing this model around how we might think how leaders have responded to the challenges of what's been going on, and to make sense of how perhaps we might have responded, how we also might reflect. It helps us to understand what stages our organizations are at, and perhaps also what the key issues are that we're facing. So first off, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the model, and then I'll move into also some of our responses from some leaders such as yourselves around the key challenges that they're facing. So firstly, This model that we constructed was around what we were seeing and hearing. You can see here there's two axes, one about mindset and one about strategy and approach here. For the mindset spectrum, that's based on this fixed to growth mindset piece around the work of Carol Dweck and the growth mindset. Here, the axis is asking us to think about our approach to the pandemic and to challenges more widely. Ask yourselves, are we fixed in our capabilities, our horizons, and our options, or are we really learning as an organization, being adaptive, agile, and willing to collaborate with others? That other axis reflects the strategies which are either rooted in re-establishing the status quo as we know it, our safe option of going back, or as quickly as possible. And the other end of this are attempts to rethink and take, as we saw in that word cloud there, the opportunities around business models, operating models, leadership models going forward as well. A focus on the new normal, or should I say a focus on a series of new normals, the plural here, that we're most likely to face. And this could also kind of be seen as a focus on the past and a focus on the future. So we asked leaders to map their responses, and it's clear what we saw from this is that we've reacted in a variety of different ways. For some, it's business as normal. For others, it's changing our leadership, culture, and strategy, our underlying beliefs at a rapid pace of change to create new business models. And also within this, there's a duality that exists in some cases around parts of our business shifting and parts of them remaining the same. An example there, if you think back to Dyson perhaps, and where one part of the organization shifting very rapidly around developing ventilators and other parts focusing on the constant pieces of the business that they're doing. Think back to those organizations that started making hand sanitizer back at the start of the pandemic, and also just generally as well within organizations where we focused on new products, new ways of delivery, new leadership structures, but also a duality where we're keeping things the same. Becomes quite difficult for us to kind of manage through that. So that was our model that helped us to try and understand, and first something for you perhaps to also reflect back in your organization around what has been some of the ways in which you've worked so far. We also asked leaders about what they thought the key challenges were, and they came up with three areas that they thought were where they decided their key challenges and focus was. The first one was around working practices and the implications of the virtual workplace. So this is around how we managing employee engagement, our onboarding, and the wider question of organizational culture in a virtual work setting. As one organization put it, those great places to work have risen to prominence. We really feel that it's a great place, and we see that more. But the flip side to this is that those bad places to work are also on the spotlight there. So that's something, again, to reflect on where your organization might be. It's time for us to consider the positive side of this new informality and the humanity that has emerged as a result of these new imperatives to connect, to keep in touch, and communicate in a more purposeful way. And for leadership, this means that leaders with that fixed traditional mindset have struggled to adapt. Whereas on the other hand, those who have been really willing to take on board that change have managed to drive pace at an unprecedented age. And we've seen this definitely in some of the digital transformation projects that have gone on over these past few months. What's clear is all leaders will need to question what the future workplace looks like right now and what it will look like in the future, and how future working practices, regardless of where we've got this global audience today, regardless of where you are, will change and adapt. The second part that they said, which were key challenges to them, was around the psychological contract. So as we saw in that word cloud, some very strong responses to how we felt here and very emotive responses to how we felt. This is how we feel about our organization, how we're being treated, how we're treating one another. It's all amplified in this environment here. And that's so important as leaders and as organizations to think about the need of how we create the right levels of psychological safety for our employees to thrive, but also in some cases to survive in this time of uncertainty and in change. And then the final piece, which was on here, was around leadership development for the digital age. Our leadership is under scrutiny. We're all considering, are we doing the right way of how we might develop? We've talked about how we behave to one another, but we're also thinking about how we need to balance both agility and compassion in equal measure. And for leaders, thinking about that importance of regular communication was cited as important, but also the leadership capabilities that are going to be needed going forward, and the discussions that organizations are having around what's going to be needed for them to thrive. So now, before we move into some of the hows of how you deal with some of these challenges, as Paul will describe some of the competencies, we're going to go back to Mentimeter. And what we're going to ask you here is just how you feel your organization has been doing to adapt to some of the challenges that some of our leaders talked about. So this is more for us to see about how we might rate our own capabilities here. So on the Mentimeter, you've got from 1 to 10 to decide how you feel you've done in terms of addressing the challenges of your changing working practices, understanding the implications of the virtual workplace, how you've done there, and how you've been creating the appropriate psychological contracts. And also this development of digital leaders, how well you might be doing there. And we'll just gather a sense of the views that are coming through there. And as we can see, as we start off with the initial numbers there, it's interesting, isn't it there, Paul, to see that that developing digital leaders isn't as high up as many organizations feel. It's one of those areas that I think many of us have been struggling with, along with that psychological contract piece. And primarily because that does require us to in some ways spend time understanding what those challenges are. And at the same time, we've all been fixated with so much work in terms of everything that has gone on there. So before I move on, you can see there a broad cross section of different views. So most of us, 7.8 there, around changing in working practices. We feel we've done that well. We feel we're adapting to those virtual workplaces, but perhaps not so much in terms of both creating that psychological contract and developing digital leaders. So now let us help you with some of that by going into some of the competencies and also some of the strategies that you can do here. So over to you, Paul.
Thanks. And I'll just say to everyone, if you're raising your questions, we're going to capture those and come back to them at the end of the webinar. So do raise your questions as we go through the course of the webinar, and we'll pick up and come back to them at the end as well. So, and just to explain the graphic here, as you can see, it's highlighting the average score, but you'll see with the shape behind the score, that demonstrates the range of scores as well that we're seeing. So quite a range of, although we may have an average, with quite a range of responses on each of those questions. And it'd be interesting to kind of see if you've got any questions about that or observations, as Harry was saying. So just going back into the as Harry was saying, okay, so what does this mean and what can we do in terms of looking at leadership competence for the digital age? So I start by thinking about a play that I'm familiar with. I don't know if anybody is a fan of the playwright David Mamet. He wrote a book called a play called Glengarry Glen Ross, which has also been made into a film. And I don't know if you're familiar with it, that the film actually stars Al Pacino, Jack Lemmon, Alec Baldwin, a whole series of stars. And the film itself looks at the life of real estate salesmen, so people selling properties. And in it, there's an iconic scene where Alec Baldwin comes into the real estate office to talk to the sales guys. And in it, he explains how performance is judged by the head office. And he essentially says, if you're top of the sales performance, you're going to win a Cadillac. If you're second, you're going to get a set of steak knives. And if you're third, you get fired. So this is a really good analogy of what's happening in the digital world. Effectively, we're in Glengarry, Glen Ross markets. Winners get the Cadillac. They come out way ahead. If you're playing second, you might get something, but it's a pretty small prize, the steak knives. And if you're really late to the party, you're probably not going to get anything. That you're fired in that analogy. So the winner takes all in this Glengarry, Glen Ross digital markets. So digital transformation calls for executives to acquire new competencies and skills to tackle their individual and their organization's challenges in the digital world. We know if we look back in 1970, the average life of a Fortune 500 company was 50 years. But today in 2020, the average life is down to 20 years. So dealing with disruption and the digital world is key to survival. In fact, 6 of the 10 largest companies today, Amazon, Google, Apple, have all, and even though some of them were born digital, have all reinvented themselves in this digital world. So in this context of, the volatile, uncertain, complex and ambiguous markets, the VUCA world, as we like to call it, executives and organizational leaders are facing unknown situations that generate enormous confusion. And the complexity increases if, within this context, people react abruptly using established and obsolete strategies, skills and methods, seeking to obtain the results in the short term, but putting their survival of their organizations at risk. So many companies prioritize this partial, limited vision instead of giving precedence to a transformation that leaders and organizations need to undertake to remain competitive in a digital environment. So now of course, with COVID, we've seen the acceleration of digital transformation as well, where research indicates that in 5 months, we leapt forward 5 years in the adoption of digital technologies and digital models. But having said that, we still have these unknown challenges for leaders and their organizations. And the speed of transformation in the digital world requires individuals and organizations to grow exponentially. Now, according to a recent IDC survey, it's saying that investment in digital transformation will grow to over $300 billion in 2021. So we've got a variety of technologies there, artificial intelligence, machine learning, the Internet of Things, and so forth. And all these will set the pace. And facilitating this transition requires executives and organizations to develop a new set of skills and competencies so as not to be left behind. Now, I'm going to run through 11 of these competencies and skills. And at the end of them, I'm going to ask you to rank them in terms of how you see how important they are. So just going to run through these leadership competencies, as we call them, for the digital age. So the first one is contextual intelligence. And that's really associated with understanding the organization's particular environment. It consists of 3 fundamental components. The first one is hindsight. And this is a little bit like looking and driving with a rear view mirror. So it implies we take advantage of and give value to what lessons we've learned in the past. But not all are useful. So we have to be choiceful about which ones we can apply going forward. Secondly, foresight, and that's related to the capacity to express what you want to obtain and the actions to accomplish it. And thirdly, in this contextual intelligence, is insight, which is really appropriate integration of that hindsight and foresight to identify and define the desired future. We have, secondly, strategic intelligence, and this is the capacity to anticipate trends and challenges in the market and the organization's value chain. Or, as we tend to speak now about ecosystem, and this is probably the way we want to think about things, in the ecosystem way in the digital world, rather than a kind of linear space, but a kind of surrounding space in the ecosystem. And this competency about strategic intelligence provides a conceptual system to facilitate and direct the required transformation, together with the contextual intelligence, it permits the clear definition of the what, the why, and the how needed in an organizational digital transformation. Learning agility and adaptability is linked a little bit, and Harry mentioned it earlier on, a little bit about growth mindset as well. But this is really the capacity for us to learn rapidly and effectively from experience, including the immediate application of that learning to the individual and the organization's new context. Now, we've seen this a lot in the COVID period, where we've had this huge experiment running, not one that we want to be part of, but there's driven change in organizations, and where we've had to rapidly learn about what's working, what isn't working, and adapt quickly. So this capacity and the learning agility enhance the tolerance for ambiguity and uncertainty that currently exists. With sense making and adaptability, this helps us understand the process of making proper sense of the current reality, particularly in the sense-making context. So this allows leaders and the group of collaborators to define the right course in the face of the experiences, events, or challenges that arise in this kind of very challenging and confused environment which we find ourselves in, when we're making digital transformation. It makes it possible to, when we're visioning, to create a map of the future accompanied by a range of diverse possibilities. So together, this kind of making sense of where we want, of what's going on, and then projecting a future view generates the ability to have a clarity and motivation for the members of the organization. Now, one thing that many leaders already possess, and it's really fundamental as well in terms of the digital leadership capability, is a bit about storytelling. And this is that strategic competency and one of the most important individual assets that helps create and consolidate relations and empathies among the members of a group or the organization. It can have multiple purposes, and we've seen it used in lots of instances, whether it be about highlighting the motivation behind the organization's strategy and actions, or socializing with new and motivating new collaborators, transferring knowledge within the workplace as we're restructuring or reorientating, and helping facilitate internal and external communication. In fact, developing the leadership teams and skills that help us connect with clients, consumers, and partners in the ecosystem. So high impact stories positively challenge the audience's intellect, produce emotions, contextualize and contain messages that encapsulate the digital transformation within them. So a characteristic associated with this is about the ability to be public speaking, since both substance and form are fundamental in achieving the end objective. One of the other aspects of leadership is this sense of emotional and social intelligence. And I'm sure this has been demonstrated a lot over the last few months in terms of the COVID situation. It's related to 4 areas: self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, and relationship management. It contributes to the relational capacity of the individual, strengthening personal networking and social capital inside and outside the organization. Many people believe that this intelligence is the best predictor of effective leadership, since it's relevant in a global context and broader settings. It helps facilitate learning and provides the capacity to anticipate, adapt to, create, and sustain the required change. But within all that, we need to have authenticity as well. And it really implies this ability to be and remain loyal to one's own sense of identity and experiences. And if we go back to the work of Bill George, who created a model around authentic leadership using the building blocks of purpose, what's our central driving passion, the values we hold, which may have been established way back in our earlier days, our self-discipline and the ability to be consistent in what we do, our relationships and how we connect with others, and our heart essentially demonstrate the empathy we feel with others and connections in that sense. So the exercising an authentic leadership implies operating on a daily basis in accordance with our own identity. Achieving this requires a high level of self-knowledge and transparency, setting high ethical, moral, and behavior standards. But moreover, it implies being sufficiently open and empathetic to others' opinions and points of view, which is really important in the digital world, because before making decisions impulsively or with hidden agendas, we need to understand the context of what's happening. So authenticity helps enhance our credibility and reputation, and is a positive differentiation to effective leadership. Psychological capital is important because it's related to the level of individual development and affects personal satisfaction. And there's kind of four parts to this, four psychological states, and it links back to what Harry was talking about earlier on. Hope, efficacy, our resiliency in the face of challenges, and our optimism and ability to look with a positive view of the future. At number 9, we've got creative thinking and innovative behavior. This contributes, amongst other things, to the construction of an organizational culture to generate ideas and initiatives correlated to products, services, and processes that will enrich the organization's value proposition and the way we operate. From a strategic perspective, leadership must be positioned as a driver for innovation. We know that it is the enhancer to creating value for customers and the organization itself. And we need to establish the work environment where innovation and creativity is supported, encouraged to achieve the outcomes that the organization is looking for. Number 10, we have global mindset and culture intelligence, and this is the ability to exercise a global leadership perspective, regardless of our culture or our context. And it's critical to the success of the organization. And to look at forward on how we make this happen, this kind of sense of culture intelligence, the capacity to relate to others and work effectively in culturally diverse contexts and situations is really fundamental. So this kind of sense of how we embrace and work with diversity and inclusion. So both components make it possible to promote and manage the diversity and inclusion required in the organization. And then finally, collective leadership. The ability to be inclusive and involve collaborators in the analysis and decision-making processes that generate empathy, commitment, motivation to achieve success in the organization. Leadership that's needed today cannot be authoritarian or associated with the power or position exercise. We must somehow focus on pushing down that responsibility and enabling and empowering employees at all levels. And actually, for those organizations that perform really well in terms of the research, and certainly in the connections that Harry and I have had with the organizations, have done this very effectively in the COVID world, pushing down this ability to empower and decision-making at a low level in the organization. So this capacity to promote decentralized decision-making, fomenting high levels of collaboration and a sense of shared objectives within the team. So those are the 11 different leadership competencies we have observed that help organizations be successful in the digital age. And what I'd like to ask you to do is to think about those different competencies we just run through and to share your perspective in terms of how you would rank them in importance. So we're just going to go back to Mentimeter again, and you'll see that you have the opportunity to rank each of those 11 in order of importance in terms of your view. So first one is the most important, and then the other 11. And it's quite interesting when we've been looking at organizations over the past few months, and there's been some interesting perspectives. And one of the topics I mentioned there was about learning agility and adaptability. And at Fiat Chrysler, they're actually really challenging their people to be accountable both as individuals and as a group for their own development. And that means that they're asking their people to take learning into their own hands to address these challenges based on real business issues. So they place the accountability and the learning to get results within the firmly within the responsibility of the organization. At Deloitte, they have a similar or an approach as well about learning agility, which is what they call the next gen experience. And that's really focusing on Deloitte's view of the potential to learn. So they select people in their organization for NextGen who are based on a strong track record of performance, but also this high potential for leadership and demonstrated commitment to developing themselves and others. So then they ask people to think about self-reflecting, assessing themselves, and coaching as critical inputs to the leader's development plan. So there are, tangible examples for each of all of these competencies that we've mentioned that we can see starting to be applied in organizations in the current time. And it's really interesting to see how you're ranking the importance of these different competencies or skills in the digital age. It looks like we're getting emotion and social intelligence is high up there. And then, just as I've been talking about the the learning agility and adaptability, we've certainly had lots of practice at both those at 1 and 2 in the last few months in terms of COVID. But of course, for many organizations, that's also been driving the digital transformation that we've seen. And we see the long-term trends in many industries where, yes, we knew that latent digital transformation was there, but it tended to be put off either because of the costs, how to manage the revenue streams in the medium term. But with COVID, it's forced that transformation, and people have made that change very swiftly as well. So we can see here many of the traits that we've been talking about and the ranking for them. And so we have emotional and social intelligence up there at top, learning agility at number 2, and strategic intelligence and innovation coming in 3rd and 4th. And in terms of our level of importance, psychological capital and storytelling down there at 10th and 11th. I will leave that Menti page open, but I'd like to hand back to Harry so we can just see how we can take this, the context that we've been talking about forward. So Harry, back over to your good self.
Thank you. So I'm going to talk now just to close off around these strategies that we need to develop this going forward, the how, the what, why, and how do we get that to happen? So it's very clear that if we really want to get these competencies involved, we need to think about how we're going to implement them, develop them within our leaders, and that will then help us to both generate this impact and transformation that we need in this digital age. So the first one here is about how we can be people focused. Extensive large-scale change can't occur without the involvement and motivation required in the organization's talent. So the desired transformational journey must be extremely clear, depicting the associated what and what for. Where we see when we have a lack of motivation or objectives or not so clear goals, that becomes synonymous with both marginal progress or imminent failures that we see. And then this second piece here about how we define and implement the required processes. So once we have the what and the what for that's been established in that first phase, it's defining the how is fundamental here, expressed through the processes and the activities that are connected to this transition, considering the current and desired status that we want to create, as well as thinking about the different areas and functions that comprise in our organization. And finally, this piece around establishing a framework here. The what, why, and how will provide us the foundation for establishing the platform upon which transformation is required. But since the future, as we know, is so highly complex, especially as we've learned that from this year more so, one of the most important considerations is to ensure that we have the right systems to think about and the right frameworks to think about how we're going to deal with the agility, the scalability, and the interoperability of the organization. So it's with these strategies, developing those competencies there, thinking about your context within your organization, that you'll be able to overcome the turbulence and the challenges of developing leaders in this digital age. So we hope we've inspired you with some thoughts and some reflections on your organization. And with that, we'll now move over to some questions that we've received here. So I think, Paul, I might just kick off because a couple of those were related to mine here. So the study that I
Yep.
talked about, it was based here in the UK with larger organizations of just over 200 leaders in predominantly HR, talking through some of the challenges that they had there. We've also had a couple of questions which are talking about how do we really shift? We want to create a growth mindset. We want to develop what we're trying to do here, but how do we do that? Because we're so deep rooted into where we need to go. And for that, I think what organizations might need to think about is, and for yourselves as well, is to think about what is the prize at the end of this. We know that for many organizations who have done what they're doing fast and agile with a growth mindset, we see great levels of growth for them. And perhaps it's about centering just where you are now as an organization and where perhaps you might be is one of the ways in which you can do that. Paul, over to you for.
Yeah, there's a couple of really good questions around digital leaders, and one really saying, how can you develop digital leaders when they come from an old school mindset? And I think this is, of course, in most cases, leaders of organizations are coming from a framework, a way of working, which is, if we like to call it that, an old school mindset. And the challenge is, how do we make that change? And there was another question, which is also talking about which competencies are the most important really in terms of the digital age. So often when I'm working with organizations about digital transformation, I think the first situation is to give people a perspective on the macro trends, what's going on in the digital world, how things are actually happening in other markets and will happen to their markets as well. And actually even drawing out for them the sense of how digital technologies are already affecting their customers and the operations of their organizations. So there's a little bit about presenting that picture. The second thing is really to help people reimagine their organization. And in this, there are some things around the digital world which are really important to kind of engage with. I mean, we know that focusing on customers is really important, but those organizations that are most successful in the digital world, it's not really about the technology. It's about their ability to engage with customers and to really understand their needs, the pains they've got, and solving those. So one of the abilities is to look outside of the organization, connect with customers, and then think about the business model, the way that decision making is also made in the organization. So for example, there's a lot more now prevalence around digital data-driven decision making. And then I think the third part is how we execute for success and what is the implementation mechanism for that. And I think that's where many of the leadership competencies we talked about will then play a part at different stages in the execution as we bring people in, help them reimagine the organization, story tell what the future is going to look like, lay that out, explain that, but give people the sense of passion and purpose about what they're focusing on, and lay out how that process is going to work and help people engage and engage differently with the future. So I think there's a range of different things there in terms of how digital leaders transform, but I think laying out the picture, helping them reimagine the future, and then laying out the path for implementation.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. And I see that we're running out of time. I've had a very quick look through the questions there, and there's a chunk of questions around, what's the top one or two competencies? What might we think about in the digital age, which are really core to some of those competencies that we've talked about there? And I think for that, you really need to think about, for your organization, your context, your market, it's a point of taking a step back, reflecting, and thinking, what is it that is going to get us there? There is no magic formula to which competencies might work. It's dependent on, as we've talked about, different industries, different contexts, different cultures in which we're in. So really, it's about taking that step back and thinking around what perhaps have our competitors done, and how have they got there faster. Looking externally at other organizations you might want to also emulate. And also, finally, it's thinking about the resources and the quick wins in your organization that you can get. As we know on the change agenda, quick wins are so important in getting that motivation and getting things moving there. So I think we are out of time. We have overrun by a couple of minutes there. I hope that we've answered some of those questions, but do feel free to reach out to our colleagues, and we'll be happy to kind of continue some of those discussions. And thank you very much for listening. So before we go, we just also like to tell you a little bit more about how you can explore some of the ideas and some of the concepts we've talked about today. So if you'd like more content on these, we invite you to explore our Leadership Live executive education platform, through which we've expertly curated leadership and professional development content guides through a personalized development journey to ensure that they're developing the skills that matter most to you. And so a link is currently being shared to you there in the chat, and that will give you an opportunity to delve in a little bit more into some of those competencies and strategies that we've talked about today. So thank you very much for joining us. We wish you the best of luck for all of you in your leadership development there, and the best of luck in what goes on for you and your families in 2020 and 2021 as we come out in a much more positive and optimistic world in which we'll all be in. So thank you from both me and Paul today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Take care. Stay safe.